John, you're good to go.
Okay. All right, I'm live. So good morning, everybody. It's 9:30 a.m. tomorrow morning down here at the end of the world. I'm in New Zealand. So thank you very much for the opportunity to give this presentation. The topic of my presentation is VFP C Compiler towards another decade of secure, extensible, portable VFP apps. So without further ado, I'm going to spare you the sight of my mug and move to screen sharing so that we can get started on this presentation. Okay, so I go for screen sharing and we're going to share that one. Hopefully you can now see my screen. So I've got a very simple LibreOffice Impress or PowerPoint presentation here. So about myself, I am a medical doctor, or I was until 1992, when I stepped aside for a year, I thought, to develop some software for doctors. I've been using Fox since the dark ages, and I believe I was the first commercial user of VFP C Compiler, which I began using in 2010. More to the point is this person, Mr. Chen. He is a Chinese national who has been working with VFP for almost as long as I have, and who is responsible for both the VFPA add-on for Microsoft VFP, which is VFP Advanced, which, as many of you will know, is a project to fix various bugs in VFP 9 and also provide extensibilities, improved interoperability with newer operating systems, including 64-bit, a very successful add-on which is very widely used. He's also the author of VFP C Compiler, which I'm going to talk about today. And just for clarity, I have no association with either of those products. My only role is as a paying customer. Very pleased to be one. Okay. So my talk today, first of all, principles and purpose. Why would you want to do this? Some samples, followed by some gotchas that I've picked up over the years, a bit of stuff on build automation, and then if there's time at the end, we can look at some of the things you can do to compile even something really quite sophisticated like a West Wind COM server, using VFP C Compiler. So why would you want to do it? Well, first thing is that when you look at VFP, it is a 32-bit application. VFP was very advanced in the early days. When VFP 3 was produced, I believe it was Microsoft's first application which allowed both 16 and 32-bit development. It beat Visual Basic by some time. But since then, Microsoft has moved on. Increasingly, 64-bit operating systems are the norm. And people are concerned that VFP, which was written in VFP in C++ 7.1, which was released quite a long time ago now, 2003, and Microsoft is now up to version 14, people are concerned at the possibility of long-term interoperability problems creeping in, or things that used to work no longer working. And VFP C Compiler gives you the opportunity to settle some of those concerns. The other thing is compression and or encryption. Now, in the old days, we used to use products like Concise and Refox. Refox is an excellent tool which allowed us to both compress and encrypt our VFP executables, send them off to customers. That's no longer possible with VFPA, and Jan, who wrote Refox, has indicated to me personally that he's not going to be updating it to use VFPA. So that's the first thing. VFP C Compiler allows you to compress and encrypt your applications. You can now embed C++ functions in your actual application. One of the consequences of moving to 64-bit is that things that we've become accustomed to in the 32-bit environment no longer work. And even something as fundamental as the Microsoft Common Controls, OCX, no longer works when you move to 64-bit. Similarly, any VFP FLL that you've used routinely, which would include Craig Boyd's excellent encryption and compression FLLs, no longer functions in 64-bit. So you need some other way of providing your compression and encryption, if that's what you've been doing. So VFP C++ compiler gives you that opportunity. You can actually now inline C++ code into your VFP code. And what I mean by that is if you've got some VFP code, you can put a snippet of C++ code in there. And when it compiles your application, it will actually run that C++ code at that point in your code. So you can use that for things like protection, or you can even embed an encryption routine directly into your into your VFP code, and it will run as part of the compiled result. So, as I hope to show you, this is a very powerful protection against hacking. And I think that if you've used VFP C++ compiler to protect your application, some people say that they don't really think that they need to do that. What's happening out there is that there's increasing concern about hackers using other applications to find passwords to databases and otherwise get past normal mechanisms of protection. And I think if you've protected your application in this way, your customers can be very reassured, and they can even conduct a security audit. And as you'll see, good luck with that. Okay, so that's pretty much the end of my useful PowerPoint presentation. So what I'll do is I'm going to bring the paper back down here so we can all look at various parts of it. So we've really covered all of those things. There's some quite good introductory material in my paper. So first thing is installation of the product. Now, until last week, this was quite important because over the years, I've seen a number of people trying to install VFP C++ compiler and having quite a lot of trouble. And there's various reasons for that trouble. So if we just click on that link, hopefully it's going to bring up the browser. It's offering to translate it for me. Okay. So this is Mr. Chen's download page, and as you can see, there's a number of options here, and one of them is the Visual C++ compiler. I'm going to download that now. So it's coming down, coming. And once it's downloaded, it comes down as an archive. So I can just go to my downloads here, and hopefully doesn't look like it's come. Try that again. It's still coming. Okay, so we've downloaded the archive which contains the VFP C++ compiler. I'm going to open that file. Okay. All right, there it is. So, Open Archive. So it's a pretty standard set of files here. I'm just going to copy these, put them somewhere for temporary purposes. Okay. All right. Right, so we've downloaded the installer. We've got a README first, worth reading. When you do it yourself, you might want to have a look at that. It gives you some good pointers and some information to help you avoid trouble. But we're just going to go ahead and do the setup. Now, because it's got the word setup in the file name, it asks whether you want to escalate privileges, which of course we do. This basically says you need to have VFP, all care, no responsibility. So we'll accept the agreement. Right, so there's two prerequisites if you want to be able to use VFP C++ compiler. You've got to have VFP and you've got to have C++. That's probably not a surprise. There's two reasons why you need VFP. The first is that this is a VFP add-on. It is not a replacement for VFP, and it is not a means of avoiding your VFP licensing obligations. And the second reason is that unlike other protection and add-ons, VFP C++ compiler actually needs to open your project and make significant changes to it, and it then needs to rebuild the project. So it actually needs the VFP IDE in order to function. Unlike some of the other tools, which only work on the executable and therefore theoretically don't need the VFP IDE, this absolutely does. So you can validate VFP's installed, and if it can find it, you get an installed version of Visual Fox Pro is found. Now, I've got some good news. In my paper, and until this week, it says that this installer only looks for VFP in the default location, which is in the C program files or C program files x86, depending on your operating system. But as of this week, the installer now goes into the registry and it will find your VFP9, which you've installed to C:\VFP9, which I know many developers did to avoid the joys of IDE, and you'll get a pass. So that's a very nice improvement. It's also an example of how responsive Mr. Chen is. That was raised with him on Wednesday this week, and on Thursday, the installer is now looking in the registry to find C:\VFP9 or E:\VFP9 or whatever you've done. So that's one cause of problem is now eliminated. The second one is that if you've got the demonstration, it assumes VC++7 and you no longer need to install VC. So previously, in order to use Visual C++ compiler, you needed to have a version of VC++ installed so that it could compile your applications. And that proved to be a problem for a lot of VFP developers. We don't know anything about C++, many of us. We don't need to, don't particularly want to. And a lot of people struggled, especially with newer versions of C++, which can require net and other dependencies to come along with it. And so I know some people gave up. So now, basically, in the demonstration installer, it assumes C++ version 7. The validation always passes. And now you may have noticed that this tab becomes available. Okay, so where are you going to install it? The default is the program files x86 or program files in a 32-bit system. you may as well choose that. The reasons that you don't want to choose that for VFP 9 or VFPA don't apply here, and that VFP C++ is not wanting to maintain stuff in its root folder. So you can put it there. If you don't want to, put it somewhere else, no problem. You can, at this time, arrange for the VFP C++ compiler to be added to your menu so that you can quickly and easily compile your project directly from the VFP IDE. And then you click Install Now. Now, I won't do it because that will overwrite my existing full version of Visual C++, which I'd rather not do. But it really is as simple as that. And it will now install the application to your chosen location, and you can try it out. So if you haven't, or if you've had trouble in the past because of either VFP in a non-standard location, or because you hadn't installed C++ or had problems installing C++, it's worth another try. You can now install this product and start compiling. Right, so what are the sorts of things that you can do with Visual C++ compiler? Well, what I'm going to do is if I come and look in the actual Visual C++ compiler folder, there it is. It's worth running through some of the contents in this folder. So you've got Foxrun 6 through to Foxrun 14264. Whenever you see that word Foxrun, it is referring to the VFP C++ compiler's C++ compilation in some shape or form. It's got something to do with the actual C++. And if we look in these, there's various dependencies. And these are things that you can use to compile a set of VC source codes into a fully fledged DLL. Now, to some of you, this will be quite familiar. To others, you have no idea what it is. Basically, the link.exe is the compiler and linker, and these make files are C++ make bat commands. And there's several of them because actually the C++ compiler is actually quite smart. It can actually do things like identify reused code or repetitive code and move that out into subroutines, which then get called from the C, and that reduces the size of your DLL. Or it can optimize the DLL for maximum speed. But as I hope to show you shortly, there's other ways of affecting size and speed that would overwhelm any of the advantages you might see by messing with this. My strong advice is, even if you know all about C++, leave all this alone. The beauty of VFP C++ compiler is you don't need to know anything about C in order to use it, unless you've reached the point where you want to start embedding C++ in your code. Until then, you can use the compression and the encryption features without knowing one thing about C++. Okay, so those Foxrun folders are all for the various C++ compiler options. Moving on down, you've got VFP 6 to VFPA and VFP 64 folders. Those contain runtimes and other material needed to compile with that version. If you've got the version, you'll have stuff in here. If you haven't got the version, well, you're not going to be able to use it. Coming on down here, RTFM absolutely applies. The readme_en and the FAQ_en are really well worth reviewing if you want to have a crack with this product. We have a look at them. So this is running through a list of the various settings in VFP C++ compiler. Basically, you've got two ways to access them. One is through an IDE, which I'll show you shortly, and the other is by editing the VFP C++ compiler command files using a text editor like this. And this gives you lots of information about everything from inlining assembly code to inlining C++, which will be just above there, and ways that you can turn off and turn on compilation, and a few gotchas that might catch a few people out. All right, so definitely RTFM. And these you'll recognize as the various Visual C++ runtimes. Okay, so there's several ways that you can start up VFP C compiler. One of the obvious ways is by running the actual application in the install folder. And if you do that, up comes the immediately recognizable VFP C IDE. And the green color you get used to, and it's actually quite good because it stands out when you've got quite a lot going on. So I think some of this is self-explanatory. I'm not going to belabor it. Some or all of these options may be visible to you when you use this in the demo version, but you can certainly select your project file and your output files and things. You can select which VFP runtime you want to use. You can select which C++ compile file you want to use. Now, you may recall I showed you those make bat files. It's the make bat file that you want to select. Usually the standard make.bat is the one you want. In this case, it's under Foxrun 10, so it's defaulting to VFP C++ 10. And then you've got your various compilation options down here. And just in case you're looking at that and saying, whoa, there's more compile options, which comes up. And just in case you're saying, whoa, about that, there's more again, which it won't let me do because I haven't picked my file name yet. Okay, so that's one way that you can bring up the VFP C++ compiler IDE. The other way is that when the installer is working, it actually puts a file association, and you can actually bring up C++ compiler for your project by double-clicking the file associated with it. And there's some examples in here. If I go into VC SDK, now these, I'm sorry, but these are not included with the demo version. So I guess the story is if you want to be able to do some of the stuff quickly and easily, then you need to get the full version. So let's look at my compress test first of all. Just for interest, I'm going to go into the 64-bit version. Okay, so I'm looking at my compress test under 64-bit, and you can see there's a VFP C++ compiler command file, or compiler start file. If I double-click that, it brings up VFP C++ compiler, which has got the project, the output defaults to the project name with an exe and DLL, and it's got the version of the VFP I want to use, which in this case is the 64-bit version. It's going to compile to 1064, so that's one of the extra version 10 iterations for 64-bit. And you can see there's quite a few options selected here. So basically the deal is you set up your compiler start file to exactly how you want it, and you can then reuse that endlessly by either double-clicking the start file, or you can actually invoke it from a bat file or command line interface with a parameter. Okay, so what does this actually do? This is already compiled. You've got a mycompresstest.exe, and you've got its companion mycompresstest.dll. The DLL is the C++ compiled DLL, which now contains the vast bulk of your application. So I run that, compress, uncompress. Pretty simple. Points to note, there is no DLL in here to perform the compression which you've just seen. That's all been included in the C++ DLL as C++ code, which your application can now run without any companion DLLs. If we look under this foxrun folder, you'll recall I said that anytime you see foxrun, that's got something to do with C++ compilation. So there's quite a lot of stuff in there. My advice is don't worry about it, just use it. You can use that folder in your own application and you will be able to do what you've just seen this application do. Okay, let's look at my encrypt test. Same deal. In this one, there's a foxrun.h and a foxrun.o.h. Those contain the C++ code, which is required for encryption, which in this case is an AES here. I think Mr. Chen allows several forms of encryption, which you have some control over. So same deal. There's the VFP C++ start file there. It's already been encrypted to my encrypt test and my encrypt test.dll. So if we run it, it's like that. Okay. And if we go into my encrypt test.aes, okay, so I've done this on purpose. Basically what this is confirming is that this test has actually tried to use Craig Boyd's wonderful vencryption 7.1.fll, which many of you will be familiar with, but it's not working because this is a 64-bit application which cannot call a VFP encryption. I'll be a 32-bit FLL. So it can't work if you're trying to use that. So if we now go to the 32-bit version and look under my encrypt test AES, okay, this explains why it was trying to use that FLL, because basically you can encrypt and then you can decrypt either using or not using Craig's DLL. And what this is showing you is that whether you utilize the FLL or not, you're getting exactly the same result. But actually, that's the only purpose, and the rest of the encryption that's occurring is inside these foxrun files here, which if you look at them, these are a library construction kit, C++ DLL, which if any of you have had a look at C++ before for things like MD5, it's all here. We're able to perform MD5 and encryption based upon this library, which you simply copy these two files into your application folder, and then when C++ compiler works, it will actually incorporate them, and you can then call the encryption functions in there. So you may be saying, yeah, that's all very well, but how? How do we call the encryption files in there? So if we just bring up the project, what happened there is I just double clicked that and I don't know what happened. Try it again. Whatever I'm doing, it's not bringing up what I expect to see in VFP. Okay. What we'll do then is we'll bring up this and just open it manually. So if we have a look inside the actual project, and my encrypt test, we'll go for this one. Okay. Right. One of the joys of installing into the program files folder strikes again. Do here, if I run that as administrator, now the wretched thing should let me do it. it's only 64. It doesn't make any difference. We'll go for this one. My encrypt test. Okay. Hoorah. Right, so if we have a look in here, we've got a screen. You'll hopefully recognize this. So it's calling a function called f_myencrypt. And if we look in the start program, here we go. So for this purpose, this mydecrypt function is a new function which is included in that C++ DLL, and you can now call myencrypt and mydecrypt with some parameters that many of you will recognize. So there's the encryption string, there's the length of it, there's the key, and there's the length of the key. Fairly standard encryption type functions. You can now replicate that in your own VFP application, and it is in fact calling the function in the C++ DLL so that you can now encrypt and decrypt without a companion DLL. Now that's one way to do it, and if we get time, I'll show you another way, which is you can actually inline encryption directly into your VFP code so that the C++ runs seamlessly through your code and then directly into the encryption and decryption without calling anything separate, which makes it fearfully difficult for any hacker that's trying to access your stuff. Okay, so time is marching on. So what I'm going to do is, associated with this presentation today, there should be some files. And if you have a look in those files, there's a project sample there which allows us to have a look at some good features of Vfp C++ compiler. So if you have a look at this, pretty simple piece of code. What it's basically doing is it's getting the day of the week and then a random number of times walking through the days of the week until it reaches today's day. And it's bringing up some of the sayings from the so-called fortune-telling poem, which some of you may recognize. A lot of history in this. Fortune-telling goes back to the 1500s, but never mind. Okay, so if we run that, what it's doing is it's using Foxy Dialog, which many of you will recognize, which is a very nice tool to modernize the VFP dialog boxes. Okay, that one it found Friday straight away. We'll try it again. So it's going to start. Today is not Saturday. Okay. So you get the idea. Okay, right. Let's say that we want to compile this application in VFP compiler. So first thing is VFP C++ compiler actually needs to access this project in order to build your compiled application. And that is because unlike other tools that work on the executable, this is actually rebuilding your application from scratch. It's substantially modifying your PRG and other files. The code is then being bundled through into C++, and it then needs to leave some code in your VFP executable in order to call it DLL. And that means it's got to have access to this and everything in it. So if I close that, and instead, if I go into here and go to where I know the folder is, which is there, I have left myself a C++ compiler file. So again, two ways to access VFP. There's many ways to access it. I can just double click that and it'll bring up the compile start file. So there is my application. Default is an executable and DLL of the same name. I'm going for 32-bit VFPA. I'm using Foxrun 7, which you'll need to do as well when you're doing your demonstration version. And we'll go through some of these examples here, but without further ado, if I click Start, most of the time's actually taken compiling Foxy Dialog, which you'll know is quite a big piece of code. But it still finishes the application. And if you watch down the bottom here, you can actually see in the background some black command line interface lines coming up. So it's running make.bat now to actually do the VFP C compilation. You'll see down here in the background, there it is. So if you, I was too slow. If you're fast enough, you can bring that up and actually see the compilation occurring. Okay, so completed in 53 seconds. And if we now look in that folder, there's now a sample1.exe and a sample1.dll. And if we run it, okay, so you've now got an executable and DLL, which is able to do what we just showed you before. So that's very nice. We come back into here. I had actually left compress executable file and executable on. I'm going to turn those off. If we look at the sizes of these files, 63 and 177. Come back here and do it again. Bit quicker this time because it's not having to do the compression that I'd left on. Okay, bit quicker that time. And if we look at the file sizes now, the DLL is, so that was 63 and 177. So you can see that the C++ is about 4 times larger if you don't use compression. So there's your first two options. You can compress the executable files and you can encrypt the executable files. And you can even include the VFP support library. If you include the VFP support library with various options, you no longer need to distribute your VFPA or VFP9, whichever one you've chosen. You won't need to distribute that with your applications anymore. It's actually built right in there with your application. It does increase the size of the application by about 2 megs usually. So it's not free, but it is quite a nice distribution mechanism. Pack executable file, basically look in the paper, but if you use Moldbox or one of those commercial packers, you can actually generate a bat file which goes into the folder, and then when you use this option, it will actually run that as well. And you've got a few other options here. It's worth for interest having a look at them. An interesting one to look at, which we'll do now, is debug mode. Now, when we look in the folder here, there is a Foxrun folder which has appeared, which we'll talk about shortly. But there's actually no other evidence of what VFP C++ compiler has been up to. And that's because when it's building, it generates temporarily some folders in here, which it moves your source code and screens and everything else into. And then when it's finished, it cleans them up. So if you compile with debug mode, it leaves them there. And that means you can have a look and start to get an idea of what it's actually doing. So this time, there's going to be a lot more stuff left there for your interest. Okay, so it's almost done. When it reaches 80%, that usually means it's just about to go for the make. And then if you've got encryption checked, it'll do the encryption. If you've got compression checked, it'll do the compression, and you can actually see the little, in the background, the little command line dialogues. There we go. So that's how fast it is. Okay, so it's done. 49 seconds. If we have a look in the folder now, a lot more stuff here. So there's a number of log files and other pieces of information which you can use to understand what's been going on here. The main ones would be, you've got your foxrun PRG temp 0 and your foxrun PRG temp 1. If you look over here, I've got compile and encrypt set to level 1, which is why the foxrun PRG temp goes up to 1. Now, if we had screens and other things, there'd be more foxrun folders for the screens and other material. But in this case, there's only PRGs, so there's only PRG temp 0, which is the first run through, and then PRG temp 1. What's in them? Okay, so you'll see it's moved the programs in the project into here. And if we look at them, it's interesting. We'll just open another copy of VFP there. Okay, so you saw main.prg before. Here's main.prg, which VFP C Compiler has begun converting into your C++ DLL. No doubt you recognize everything we're seeing here. There's the source. And here's what it looks like now. Obviously tremendously similar. What do you think? All right, so that is the first round of the compilation, which is being converted into the C++. And what I would invite you to conclude is that this is so dissimilar to what went before that the prospect of trying to convert this back into the original source code is mind-blowingly difficult, especially when you look at things like that. Since when has VFP got a go-to command? I would put it to you, it's no longer possible without a massive effort to try and retro decompile that back to the source that it came from. So what's actually happening here is this is the interim stage of the move to C++. A lot of this is now going to go to C++. So if we come out of there, and if we look in this, the second level folder, so that's foxrun temp 0. If we look in foxrun temp 1, this contains what's going to be left in the VFP application. So this is the VFP code that's going to be left in your VFP executable. So the bottom line is I was actually going to show today how easily you can decompile a VFP executable, even if it's been refoxed or had anything done to it. I decided not to. Mr. Chen didn't think it was a good idea, and I agree. We don't want to give people ideas. But the bottom line is, with VFP C Compiler, even if someone does go to all the effort of pulling this out of your VFP executable, which you've both compressed and encrypted, they've still got it out. Well, good luck with that. Make of it what you will. Because what's happened is that a lot of these calls are actually calling functions in the C++ DLL, which is where the work now occurs. So this is not going to help you if you're trying to steal somebody's intellectual property or figure out passwords or anything else. It's worth having a look at the Foxy dialog as well. If we go back to the project and have a look at Foxy dialog, just bear with me for a second while I find it. There it is. Okay, so go into the code here and we look at the Foxy dialog. Many of you will recognize this. Very nicely laid out VFP source code. Okay, and we go and have a look in here. Same deal. Go-tos all over the place. Okay, so if you imagine that your own program code, your various events in your screens, your methods, everything else has had this done to it. And that main.prg example I gave is really quite a simple example. This is what you can expect with a more complicated piece of code. And if we then look at the level 1, this is what stays in VFP. So you can imagine your own code, which somebody could pick through and get useful information out of. This is no use to man nor beast. And there's really no hint of what this code originally did. Okay, so that's how easy it is to use VFP C Compiler. Let's just now, we've got time, so let's have a look at some of these other options. We've covered the compression, we've covered the debug mode, application debug mode. If you compile with application debug mode on, every line of code that runs gets put into a log file, and it's got 2 logs per line. One of them has got a greater than sign followed by the line of code, and the next line has got the less than sign, which indicates that the application has gone into that command and has come back out of it without an error. So this allows you to find out where your application's gone wrong. The reason it matters is because if you look at what we just looked at, in here, that's line number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So if an error occurs in there, you can have a log file which says error line 7, syntax error, whatever it might be. But if you look at what's happened to it in here, if the error is in line 12, where does that relate to in your original program? The bottom line is it doesn't. Usually you can't even see this because you haven't kept the foxrun file. So it's impossible to produce a log file which gives a useful line number in your original source code. And the way around that is to produce an application log file which lets you see each line of code that runs. Not only that, it actually shows you changes of values of variables. So sometimes you even find bugs in your existing VFP when you run with application log mode because you've got unexpected results in some of your variables. So I won't do that now because we're running out of time, but it's worth trying that out so that you know what's available to you as for debugging tools. Okay. a brief run through of these compiler options. The ones that matter are your variable names, and basically you can either compile or not compile variable names. I recommend you do compile variable names. And what that does is it converts all of your names, your variable names like LC password, can be converted to something unrecognizable. It usually starts with __ VC. So if we look in here again, that sort of thing there is what LC password gets converted to if you have the variable name turned on. So that's quite nice for protection. Now, you've got to be a bit careful, because if you use scatter memvar and gather memvar, the last thing you want is your field names being converted into __ VC, so that suddenly your code no longer works. But VFP C++ compiler is smart enough that it won't compile variable names that match the names of fields in cursors or tables or remote views or local views that you've used in your application. The other thing you can do is this. You can say only compile the variable names that I specify, or you can say do not compile the variable names that I specify. So if you've got a particular variable name which is used in macro substitution, or is used in an external report, or is used in a third-party tool, you can just put the variable name in there, and then VFP compiler won't compile that variable name. So that's quite useful. The other way you can do it is, if you have a look at the various ways you can assign variable contents. Here I've used the equal sign. Okay, if you use the equal sign, VFP C++ compiler will usually compile that variable. If you use the store command, comment that out, VFP C++ compiler will not compile that variable name. So there's one way for you to control what happens. Now, many developers use store if they've got multiple variables, either been given an empty string or 0 or something like that, and they may be disappointed that because you've used that efficiency technique, VFP C++ compiler will miss out those variables. So what you can do is, see I've got a comment there in ally today equals. Because that's there, VFP compiler will in fact compile that, because you can do things like put okay. So those comments mean that you do want VFP compiler to compile those variables. So there's some ways that you can use to control what happens with your variables. Be a little bit careful. If you're using third-party apps, they sometimes have macro substitution or external reports that require a particular variable name. And if that happens, you can either use store or you can edit to your lists in here. Okay. Next thing is decomposition. You can expand statements with evaluate and character strings. In my opinion, decomposition is one of the very strong benefits of VFP C++ compiler. Decomposition is covered in the paper, so have a look at it. But basically, if we compile again So there's your warning. You can't have the project open in another place. You've got to have everything. I actually recommend closing VFP completely just to make sure you haven't still got dependencies trapped in there, which will prevent VFP C Compiler doing its thing. Okay, so it's building again using debug mode, except this time we've got that additional decomposition option turned on. What decomposition does is it blows out any ifs or loop type expressions you've got. So if you've got if x or y, it decomposes that into an if x and then an if y beneath it, so that your logic becomes much more convoluted and tricky. Okay, so almost done. We have a quick look at that. Okay. Make.bat, it's doing the actual compilation of the C++. Okay. Completed. So back we go. So if we look in here now again, so I don't know whether you can tell, but you've got much more complicated stuff. Well, see, now that there is the code which gets inserted for your application log. So I must have had application log turned on. So you can see that's how it actually does your logging. Even apart from that, everything has been substantially expanded out or decomposed out to make it much more complicated. So we're almost out of time. So the decomposition is well worth a good look. And once again, come into here and have a look and see how it looks. That gets put into your VFP executable. There it is. It's not a lot there for anyone to hook onto. All right. So we're coming up to the end of the allocated 1 hour's time. So hopefully I've given you a flavor for how easy it is to now install VFP C Compiler. If we have a look in here and go to this is the VFP C start file. And if we just look at that in a text editor, you can see all it is a series of elements with a setting and a comment or description beside them to say what they are. So you can actually control most of your functionality by using this with a text editor once you're familiar with it, or you can do it through the IDE. When you first want to use VFP Compiler with your application, the easiest way to do it is to open VFP C Compiler via whatever means you've got. Navigate to your folder, to your project folder. Select your sample, then save it. So get all your sample, get all of this set exactly how you like it, and then you can save that file. And from then on, you can bring it up whenever you need it to do your compilation. You can do the compilation by using this start icon, or you can do it with a command line interface, which is covered in my paper. And I believe we are at the 1 hour mark. So in the paper, there are some other things that you can look at once you've done your first compilation and can see how it works for you. There's some information on gotchas. The gotchas to worry about are the two big ones to bear in mind is, number one is pathing. So because VFP C Compiler needs to actually open your project, if you've used any technique like a menu item that allows you to choose a path for various versions of your product, just by way of example, that path may not be available when VFP C++ compiler opens VFP to work on your project. And then particularly for .h files, if you've got like #include my.h, it may not be able to find that. And so you can get quiet compile errors happening. So watch out for the pathing. And actually, you can set pathing in here. Remember where you find it. I don't normally do it via this mechanism. No. Okay, well, you can set your path. I thought it was in here, but I just don't seem to be able to see it. There. Okay, file search path. You can put your file search path in here, and that will actually make sure that the VFP C++ compiler can find your .h files or anything else which it needs in order to correctly build your application when it simply opens VFP from scratch. And the other interesting thing is, in your compilation, you may decide you don't want everything to be compiled, and examples of that would include large third-party libraries which are publicly available. There's not a lot of point protecting those, so put those in there and they'll be left in your VFP project. So that's pathing and external functions. The other one is #include. Now, in VFP, when you use #include, it's expecting a header file which contains constant definitions and things like that. And if you've got code, VFP code, in the #include file, that's ignored by VFP. But in VFP C++ compiler, if you use #include, it actually drops that entire #include file into the source code at that point. And that means if it includes program code, that program code now goes into your VFP program at that point, and it will in fact run. So that's just something to be aware of as a difference in behavior. You can actually utilize that because you can utilize it for things like embedding C++ code, which won't cause an error in VFP 9, but which will embed C++ code in VFP C++ compiler. All right, I don't know whether Tamer's there, but I think I've done my dash.
We actually have about 10 more minutes allocated for you. We do have a few questions if you want to take some of them.
Yeah, let's do some questions. I'll just see if I can bring... yeah, let's do some questions.
Okay, so from way back near the beginning of the session,
yep,
we see the use of some of the those C++ functions in the folders that you said you can use that.
Yep. Yes, definitely. So by way of example, if we go into myencrypttest.aes, those two functions there, if you simply drop those into your, I think it's even only that one. I'd have to go and look up his instructions. But if that's in your application folder and you run VFP C++ compiler, it will include the functions in there into your C++ DLL, and you can then call them from VFP. And the calls from VFP will also be compiled and put into the C++ DLL. So you end up with this almost like a black box of function calls, which, there's no need for any external dependencies, and the whole thing is a self-contained, self-enclosed way of doing things. Does that answer the question? Maybe I misunderstood.
My question, I can't tell you whether that answered it.
Okay.
I'm sure that two of you who asked it will comment when he hears it if it isn't what he wanted. So we had a question also from way at the beginning of the session. How is the file with the association containing all settings created?
I think I covered that towards the end. They're talking about where does that VFP C++ compiler start file come from, and what you can do is you fire up VFP C compiler from that way, and okay. And then you can navigate to your whatever your project is that you want to do. So I'll go to that one. You can set everything up the way you want it. And then you can save it. And it will then save that into the same folder as your project with the same name as the project. So it'll be sample one. I think it's VCL is the file association that he's done. VCF. So a .vcf file is created in the folder, and you can then bring that up whenever you like by double-clicking it, or it's in the paper. You can actually use a command line interface as well to start VC pointing to that compiler start file, and it will then run in an unattended mode. In my paper, I've given some examples of automating the compilation project. I strongly recommend that. We do a full rebuild with synchronized versions by setting the versions in the sample that I've given. That's also in this in the file which is attached to the to this presentation, and you can simply start it and walk away, and VFP C compiler will walk its way through compiling all of your work, standardizing the version numbers, and if you like, even signing the result. In the one that we use, we sign the result as well at the completion of VFP compilation. And that's much easier than trying to do it manually, particularly because you sort of can't do much while it's compiling in case you open something that it needs. So it's better to kind of schedule a build and walk away, come back and however long it takes, and it's all done for you.
A couple of questions about the variable stuff you talked about.
Yep.
One was, can you use your locals definitions to get C++ compiler to pick those up rather than star var equals? Can you just use locals var, comma, var2, and so on? And the other one, you want to hear both on that subject, or you want to do them one at a time?
Yeah, no, give us both, yep.
Okay, and the other was, could you define certain variables to be of integer or long integer type instead of what they are usually in VFP?
Okay, so for the first one, local actually does create the variables with a false value, but that will still be compiled by VFP compiler unless as soon as you assign the variable. So if you put oh, okay, what have I done? Oh, what am I doing wrong here? Here we go. Okay, so when VFP compiler is working, it will compile that, and this doesn't actually affect it that is what gives the flag to VFP compiler that it should be compiled. The other way to force it is the example I gave, which is to use the so if you use store for li day, that would cause it to still be compiled. So that isn't going to affect the decision about compilation. It's going to be when the value is assigned is when VFP compiler decides whether or not it's going to compile it. And then you can overwhelm that by those settings I showed you in the IDE. Those are, in the GUI, those are in fact standalone files in your project folder. So that's covered in the paper, and you can actually edit those directly with a text editor as well. It's just a list, a carriage return delimited list of variables that you can either say, I want these compiled, or I don't want these compiled. And when you do your compilation, if you've got debug turned on, there's some quite useful resources. So if we just find that, okay. So if you look in here, there's various files that have been created. And if we have a look at them, so that's telling you the variables list which the system's working on, and the various functions that are all going to be. So you see where it says delete keywords? What that's telling you is it's not going to compile that keyword, because that's a name, by which it means that it's a declared name in a DLL, and therefore you can't compile that. So there's a whole lot of deletions there, and it's quite useful to go through and see what's happened if you're having problems. And look at this one. So there's a list of all the assigned variables that are going to be used. And I think this next one, is it this one? No. One of these actually tells you your list of variables and what's been, oh, there it is there, that one. What's happened to them? Let's have a look. Okay, so there's some variable names, and there's what they've been turned into. So that's quite useful for trapping as well. And the other one was the long integer versus integer. That's a really good question, and I know why you're asking it, but I don't believe that VFP actually allows you to do that. Within the C++ itself, you probably could receive a parameter from Visual Fox Pro, which is either going to be a 32-bit integer or a double precision or whatever it might be. And probably with a little bit of C++, you could convert that into a different, a long integer or a tiny int or whatever it is that you want to use. And that could then be utilized with other external repositories or even in your own DLL. Probably Mr. Chen would be able to help with that. What I can tell you from my own experience is that he's extremely responsive. And when you come to him with questions like that, he's either got a quick answer, or he says, oh, have a look in the next version. I've done X, Y, and Z for you. And suddenly something you needed is available. I think he's actually on this call. Maybe he can answer that.
While there are several more questions, we are now at time. So I'll encourage those whose questions didn't get answered to come into the session room where you'll be doing additional Q&A. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Evan. Thanks, everybody. And once again, I'm over time, but hopefully you got some value out of it.
No, you're right on time.
Oh, good. Okay. All right. Thank you.
And I'll encourage people to stick around for the 6 o'clock Fox VFP trivia game as well.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.